Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault.
And I'm Andrew Chang. Tonight, a jump in the number of coronavirus cases on both sides of the border.
I can reassure Canadians that here in Canada, the risk remains low.
6 new cases in Canada and more deaths in Washington state.
We are now in the pre-pandemic mode.
The plan to protect vulnerable seniors from COVID-19.
A game-changing day in the race to replace the U.S. president. What you should take away from Super Tuesday.
There it is! Go! Inside! Now!
Deadly tornadoes tear through Tennessee so quickly, some couldn't get to safety.
Surrogates having back-to-back babies could be at risk.
They're not breed mares, we're people.
But who's watching out for them? A CBC News investigation. This is The National. The novel coronavirus is tightening its grip on North America. The number of known cases just keeps rising. Canada now has 33, with 2 new patients identified in Ontario and 4 more in BC.
There have been no deaths in this country, but the virus itself is deadlier than experts had initially thought.
Globally, about 3.4% of reported COVID-19 cases have died. By comparison, seasonal flu generally kills far fewer than 1% of those infected.
Now, for a time, the death rate did hover around 2%, but it's been climbing over the past week. Officials also warned of a global shortage of protective equipment caused by rising demand, price gouging, and misuse.
At this point, the biggest outbreak on the continent is in the United States, but alarmingly close to Canada. The death toll in Washington state rose by 3 today, bringing the total to 9. Greg Rasmussen is there again this evening to show us how people are coping.
6 of the 9 deaths are tied to this extended care facility, where up to 50 staff members and residents have been showing symptoms. A big part of the problem is who's inside. Elderly people, many with underlying health conditions. In other words, those most vulnerable to COVID-19. The state is ramping up spending, setting up special housing to quarantine people, and warning more infections are expected.
So it's quite clear that we are dealing with cases of community transmission in the state of Washington. And so even if you do not think you're at risk of the virus, the steps you take to prepare will help everyone around you.
This high school shut down for intensive cleaning after a student tested positive for the virus. 4 others are in quarantine, but the school reopened today.
Lots of different things that have to be considered here. It's a big puzzle, and it's a lot of unanswered questions, but we're learning as we go.
The case worries officials because the infected student had no connection to any earlier cases. In other words, it was picked up randomly in the community. Advice from officials to stock up is leading to lineups.
Toiletries, canned foods, paper products, they're out of everything.
It was even worse on the weekend.
Absolutely unbelievable. The lines went from here clear down to the end of the store, and they were restricting people how to get in.
Hand sanitizer, disinfectants, and some cleaning products have all but disappeared from stores as people take precautions.
We have 3 kids, so if they get sick for any reason, just stay at home and quarantine.
In BC, officials say be careful, but there's no need to close the border.
Still believe it's very safe for us to travel back and forth across from Washington into Canada.
U.S. officials had warned to expect an outbreak and fatalities somewhere, and this is where it's hit. The first big test for the system. Greg Rasmussen, CBC News, Kirkland, Washington.
And of course, Canadian care homes are just as vulnerable as that one in Washington state. So what are the plans here to protect seniors living in close quarters? We asked health reporter Christine Birak to find out.
Here in BC, just across the border from Washington state, the warning signs are up, reminding visitors if they've traveled to a country affected by COVID-19 or feel sick, stay away. Phone lines have been set up for families seeking updates on their loved ones.
That kind of reduces the chaos. If they can't get in touch with somebody, then people start to panic because they don't know what's happening. Necessary keep all masks.
The home is fully stocked with protective gear and medical supplies.
I am reviewing all data that's coming in from all.
Dr. Rhonda Collins is the chief medical officer for a national chain of retirement homes. She says staffing is also critical. Residents are vulnerable to all kinds of illnesses, but workers are now watching for symptoms of COVID-19, high fever, dry cough, and difficulty breathing.
We are now in the pre-pandemic mode.
If there's an outbreak and care homes are locked down, plans are in place to boost the number of staff to care for patients.
If we don't have the appropriate staff to engage them in activities, recreational activities, for instance, that means more isolation, more risk of delirium.
They're very well experienced. They've been through pandemics before.
Doctors say the entire health system has learned a lot from other outbreaks.
When we had SARS, for example, if you were 65 or older and you got that illness, you actually had a 50% risk of dying.
Compare that to the death rate from this virus. It's about 8% in those aged 65 to 79 and nearly 15% in those over 80. Still, care homes and families should be doing everything they can at this point to protect seniors. From screening and hand washing to flu shots, preventing illnesses saves lives. Christine Burak, CBC News, Oakville, Ontario.
Now, the threat of COVID-19 may well span the globe, but preventive measures are largely local, too. The Toronto Transit Commission has been disinfecting buses since late January using a hospital-grade disinfectant and an electrical charge that makes it cling to surfaces. And with a wider look at Canada's preventive measures, here's David Cochran.
I can reassure Canadians that here in Canada the risk remains low.
The risk is low, the numbers are too. Proof, the Prime Minister says, that Canada's approach is working.
There are a number of countries that have made different choices, but we are confident that what we have done in Canada, what we continue to do in Canada, is right for Canada.
We're watching Italy very closely, South Korea very closely, even Japan very closely.
Canada has rejected the travel bans and border closures being contemplated by other countries, focusing instead on screening, self-isolation, and public awareness.
We need everybody to start thinking about what do I need to do to protect my family, myself, to prevent transmission.
Prevent transmission to slow the spread of COVID-19 as much as possible. That is the underlying principle of the Canadian response to this virus. To buy time for the health system and the economy to adapt, to get through flu season and avoid stacking one health problem on top of another.
If you are sick, stay home. Stay away from others.
Canada has had no deaths, few hospitalizations, and limited spread, but health officials concede that will change.
I would think that this is a very difficult virus to stop in its tracks. So I think actually the most prudent thing to do is prepare.
That preparation is to stick as close as possible to the advice of the World Health Organization, that in the time of global spread, individual actions are key.
Social distancing, hand washing, respiratory etiquette, readying your systems.
In the absence of an actual vaccine, Canada is turning to information for protection. So an ad campaign is in the works to make sure Canadians understand the best ways to keep themselves from getting sick. David Cochran, CBC News, Ottawa.
Now, as we said, no one has died from COVID-19 in Canada, but a Canadian citizen did die in China some weeks ago, and his family worries the virus may have been the cause. Tina Lovegreen spoke to his widow, who wonders if she'll ever get the truth.
Aijun Yu is trying to find out how her husband died.
I just told you my kids, they go to the heaven, yeah.
David Zhao, a Canadian citizen, traveled to China on a business trip in January and died 2 weeks later. Speaking through an interpreter, she says she was told her husband suffered a sudden death, but she suspects it was the coronavirus.
Colleague of her husband told her David didn't feel well
He has some symptoms like a coughing, diarrhea, breathing problem, but they didn't think it was serious enough.
The 57-year-old father of two was found dead alone in an apartment the company pays for. She says many of his co-workers are from Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak.
As a wife, she had to find out the cause of her husband's death, because before he went there, he was a very healthy man.
She says an initial examination by Chinese authorities determined he'd had a heart attack, so Yu turned to Canadian officials for help on getting an autopsy report, saying China was pressing her to let the body be cremated there.
I'm so worried that his body will be cremated before the real cause is found out.
But after trading emails with Global Affairs Canada, Yu says it was left to her or a family member in China to put the wheels in motion for a coronavirus test. For its part, Global Affairs says it is aware of the death of a Canadian citizen in China and is providing assistance.
When I miss him.
Her preference now is to get the body back to Canada to do the autopsy here so she can put to rest the mystery of how her husband died. Tina Lovegreen, CBC News, Surrey.
With more deaths and infections reported daily around the world, some people are thinking twice about travel plans.
I could possibly be put into quarantine or even get the virus myself.
What Canadians are considering and the advice from health officials. That's coming up on The National.
This is a big night in U.S. politics. Super Tuesday, the single largest voting day in the fight for the Democratic presidential nomination. So millions of Democratic voters cast their ballots today in primaries in 14 states and 1 territory. So did those living abroad, picking which candidate they want to run up against Donald Trump in the fall. So that race has turned into a showdown between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. But Elizabeth Warren and Mike Bloomberg could factor in. Republicans also voted today, but their nominee, obviously Trump, is a lock. So we have reporters across the U.S. tonight watching some of the big states and the big factors in this vote. And let's start with Susan Ormiston in Washington. So Susan, results have been coming in for a bit now. What picture is emerging?
Well, Adrian, Super Tuesday has boiled down to this. Moderate Democrats and the fear of Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism have helped Joe Biden continue his comeback surge and slow down Bernie Sanders' revolution campaign. Here's the former vice president in Los Angeles tonight.
And we're told, well, when you got to Super Tuesday, it'd be over. Well, it may be over for the other guy.
Results, Biden has won 7 of 14 states, more than double the delegates of Bernie Sanders at this point, with big wins in the South, Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, attracting older and African-American voters. Bernie Sanders picked up his home state of Vermont, which was expected, but got weaker than desired results in the South. Undaunted, he got a huge reception himself tonight in Vermont.
But we're going to win because the people understand it is our campaign, our movement, which is best positioned to defeat Trump.
But those big states, California and Texas, which will come later tonight, are just critical for Sanders. About half the vote tonight. If he is significantly challenged, it is a sign that Democrats are moving towards an anyone but Sanders. Texas is still too close to call. Now, Mike Bloomberg, how about him? After a $500 million investment, he's not doing well in his first real test on the ballot. All that money, and he's not capitalizing, struggling for any significant support in delegates. He's in Florida tonight talking about Donald Trump.
Today, he sent a tweet out urging people not to vote for us. Gee, I wonder why. Clearly, Trump is scared stiff of facing us.
Now, Adrian, Bloomberg's campaign said tonight that he is reassessing whether to continue his run for the presidency. Expect more on that tomorrow.
Susan, what do you find the most striking tonight?
Well, we haven't mentioned Elizabeth Warren, Adrian, the woman with a plan for everything. She began her campaign a year ago, and tonight she lost her own state, Massachusetts. She's a senator there, and she lost it to Joe Biden. That is potentially fatal. She's attracted some delegates and vied to stay on till the convention, but she now will be under pressure to fold. So, Adrian, the Biden surge we're seeing is real. His campaign really was on life support early in February, and the establishment Democrats got behind him, and they're pushing to blunt Sanders. They've really breathed life into the Biden team. What does all this mean? At the end of tonight, we won't see a clear winner, but we will see a clear two-way race and a fight over who's going to control the Democratic Party, Adrian.
All right, Susan Ormerson in Washington, thanks very much. Next, we head to Virginia, where Paul Hunter is tonight. That state has gone to Joe Biden. And Paul, this is one of the places a particular group of voters might be having an impact.
Yeah, you know, among the many states in play tonight are a number of them here in the U.S. South, with the focus on that always important African-American vote. We spent the day today at a number of polling stations here in the capital, Richmond, and we came away having heard a forceful message. In one of Richmond, Virginia's many heavily African-American neighborhoods, at the Barack Obama Elementary School, today doubling as a polling station, Super Tuesday is a chance to mark those ballots. But for so many, it's with a separate, singular goal still months away. Gerard Booker today voted for Bernie Sanders, but
none of the candidates are a bad choice. I just felt as though my views align more with Bernie Sanders right now. But if Uncle Joe Biden, gets the nomination, I'll definitely be out there in November to vote for him.
Indeed, for so many Democrats today, it's the president who's front of mind. And for African Americans, enraged by so many of Trump's actions branded racially tinged, a recognition even at the primary stage, their vote can make the difference. To those who didn't vote at all when Trump won,
you got to get out, you got to vote. Our ancestors, they slaved for this, they worked for this, they died for this. You got to get out, and if you want change, you got to make the change. Can't just sit at home. You got to do something. But who will they choose to take on Trump?
As far as Joe's agenda.
At every doorstep, Jamal Mitchell volunteering for Joe Biden, who for years has had strong support from African Americans, talked up his choice and why.
From an African American standpoint, I like the fact that Joe has a long history of working with civil rights leaders. He's actually winning in the polls right now.
But the broad message to all Democrats eyeing the White House, African American votes matter, especially this time.
You will not be the party nominee if you do not have the African American vote.
Take all of that, Adrian, as either a reminder or a warning for those candidates who will still be battling it out from here on in.
All right, Paul Hunter in Virginia tonight. To California, part of the so-called left coast because of its political leanings. Because it is the most populous Super Tuesday state, this plays a huge role in the nomination process. Our Kim Brunhuber is in downtown LA at a watch party. So Kim, very loud watch party. What's the mood there?
Well, Adrian, here there's nervous tension, excitement, emotions that you wouldn't have seen here at this watch party 4 years ago. That's because California used to vote in June, basically when the nomination was already done. So now moving the primary up by 3 months, well, that could be a game changer for voters and for the candidates.
When I say vote, you say Bernie. Vote! Bernie! Vote!
The mood at this small rally is almost giddy.
You all will define who is the next president of the United States of America. No pressure. No pressure.
It's not pressure they feel, it's empowerment. This time, their primary could help decide it all.
How does that feel?
It feels good because now my voice is officially counted.
A far cry from 2016, they say, when Hillary Clinton basically clinched the Democratic nomination one day before California's June primary.
What you've seen this cycle have been a lot more real events and real
opportunities for candidates to get to know the people of California and for the people of California to get to know the candidates. And that has changed. That's different than it's ever been before.
The only Democrat who's different too this year, the Bloomberg factor. He spent millions blanketing the state with ads. But this expert says that won't be enough to sway one key demographic that makes up more than 20% of the state's Democratic voters, Latinos.
It has to be person to person, has to be multiple contacts, what I call deep connection. And you can't get that through media buys.
A poll released Monday suggests Sanders enjoys almost 3 times as much support from California's Latinos as his nearest rivals, Biden and Bloomberg. More good news for these supporters.
I believe that we will win! I believe that we will win!
It's hard not to get excited, they say, when the fate of the party and maybe the country could finally be in their hands.
They know that we gonna win! They know that we gonna win!
Now, California's importance in the primaries this year won't change one thing. The wait to get the results may be long and frustrating. That's because a majority of the state's registered voters tend to vote by mail, and those mail-in ballots, well, they can be accepted up to 3 days after tonight. So the task of calculating those results based on a very complex formula, well, that could take weeks, Adrian.
All right, Kim Brunhuber in downtown Los Angeles tonight. Thanks, Kim. And in about 10 minutes, we'll have more Super Tuesday analysis with our U.S. political panel. What makes this moment unique in American politics?
Now, across the continent, voting in Tennessee has been overshadowed by a deadly series of tornadoes. At least 25 people were killed and hundreds more left homeless. Stephen D'Souza shows us the devastation.
There it is! Go! Inside! Now!
Lightning over Nashville last night illuminated the dark outline of the tornado. Another twister seen here on this doorbell camera.
We've been through lots of tornado warnings and never thought that this would happen. It's just shock.
In downtown Nashville, one tornado cut a path of destruction 16 kilometers long.
Running down the hallway, the ceiling is just caving in, just debris everywhere, and water is just pouring from the ceiling and like waterfalls into the hallways.
I mean, when you're inside, it was one thing, but to walk out here now and see everything, it's bad.
The storm hit just after midnight, shredding buildings into piles of matchsticks and leaving cars flipped over. In some areas, the storm hit less than 6 minutes after the first warnings went out.
It sounded like gunshots going off. We heard the windows blowing in, and then we saw the water leaking through the ceiling, and we just grabbed the baby and tried to pack everything up as fast as we could.
This was the aftermath at an airport in Nashville. The storm left tens of thousands without power.
This is an absolutely tragic and devastating day for our city and county.
As rescue crews worked to search the debris, schools, government buildings, and transit lines were shut down. Tennessee is one of the states voting in Super Tuesday, and with some polling stations damaged, voters were delayed or forced to go to other locations. Meanwhile, the governor says the strength of the state is already showing.
Folks like this that surround this in an effort to help, that's hope in the midst of hopelessness.
The governor asked for prayers for those left to pick up the pieces of their lives. Stephen D'Souza, CBC News, New York.
We have more from a CBC News investigation into surrogacy in Canada with a warning from a woman who was a surrogate.
They're not breed mares, we're people.
Up next, the health risks she says she wasn't warned about and a call for stricter medical standards.
Ontario backs down on 2 major issues for striking teachers, but where does it leave students?
And travel plans stuck in limbo over COVID-19.
I'm going to forfeit the monies that we paid and keep my son safe.
Weighing the cost of canceling against the risk of infection. We're back in 2 minutes. Welcome back. Tonight we have part 2 of our series Baby Business. A CBC News investigation into the surrogacy industry has found there are no medical standards for surrogacy pregnancies in Canada, and that could leave women and babies at greater risk. Chris Glover shares one woman's story and her warning for others.
Already a mother of two, in 2016, Elizabeth Roberts saw her friend act as a surrogate and decided to do it too. She'll never forget the first time she gave birth to another couple's baby.
Seeing the parents hold their daughter, and the dad looked up at me and he just had tears streaming down his face and he just said, "Thank you." Come on.
But now in such pain, she can't do much more than walk the dogs. After the first birth, she did a second surrogacy within 6 months. That one ended in medical complications.
We do get wrapped up in the feel-goods. It's an incredible feedback experience, so why wouldn't you want to experience that again? You just might not be ready.
Well, leaves them vulnerable.
This high-risk obstetrician says Canada needs mandatory wait times for repeat surrogacies. He says these women tend to be older, have had multiple pregnancies, and are being implanted with other people's embryos.
So they're receiving genetic material that they've never faced before, which brings them to the higher risks.
During our investigation, we spoke to one surrogate who had a C-section birth and was implanted with another couple's embryo less than 4 months later. She says no one advised her to wait longer. And while ultimately she was fine, Dr. Kingdom says someone should have advised her to wait a year.
Pre-pregnancy counseling might have resulted in a decision not to be a surrogate or to delay it for further investigations. That's what informed choice is, and really every woman in this country deserves really good informed choice.
Health Canada told us it doesn't have the authority to force the changes Kingdom wants. The practice of medicine is regulated by the provinces and territories.
Good job.
Meanwhile, Robert's complications now require a hysterectomy. She says the system is leaving surrogates at risk.
They're not breed mares. We're people.
Chris Glover, CBC News, Toronto.
Here's some of the other stories we're watching across Canada tonight.
The government has listened. We have made decisions that are in the interests of students to get a deal, because for 300 days we've been bargaining.
The Ontario government has almost entirely backed down on two contentious issues in its ongoing labor dispute with teachers: class sizes and mandatory online class requirements. However, the province is standing firm on its 1% wage increase versus the 2% sought by teachers' unions.
I appreciate that it certainly has a veneer of reasonableness, but they didn't put these proposals to us at the bargaining table, which, you know, is problematic in itself, but it especially makes it unclear what the details of them are.
All four of the province's major teachers' unions have been staging various strikes during this round of bargaining, with another one planned for Thursday. Well, a rare legal defense has led to an acquittal for a former Calgary University student.
I issued an apology during the trial, and I feel like that came straight from my heart.
In 2018, Matthew Brown broke into a professor's home while naked and brutally beat her while high on magic mushrooms. He faced multiple charges after leaving the victim with a broken hand. Today, the judge accepted the defense's legal argument that the magic mushrooms caused him to be in a state of delirium and not in control of his actions.
Next, we break down Super Tuesday with the experts. Where does all this leave the frontrunners hoping to take on Donald Trump? Plus, why Canadians need to pay very close attention. That's right after the break. Well, Super Tuesday is the biggest election night of the U.S. primaries, meaning both the Democratic candidates and the party will be hanging on every twist, and there are some of those already. 14 states and 1 territory are up for grabs. That amounts to roughly a third of the total number of delegates being allocated in just one night. Delegates who will go on to choose the nominee at the convention in July. Also casting their ballot, Democrats abroad, including those living in Canada. So what is the state of the race after tonight? For that, let's bring in our U.S. political panel. David Frum, senior editor at The Atlantic, is in Washington. Democratic strategist Tracy Seffel is in Chicago. Presidential historian Tim Naftali is in Austin. And Cheryl Laird, assistant professor at Bowdoin College, is in Brunswick, Maine tonight. So if we can, everybody, let's start with the big trends. David, let's begin with you and then go to Cheryl. What is the story of this evening for you, David?
Joe Biden has vaulted back into first place. He had been the front runner through 2019, had a terrible tumble for the first part of 2020. Now he's back. And with him, he brings a Democratic coalition in the suburbs and African-American voters. Those are the two elements that have really coalesced here. And Biden is a candidate in many ways of continuity with the Obama years. From a Canadian point of view, he is a candidate who is in favor of NAFTA and more open trade, as opposed to many of his Democratic rivals who are more protectionist and isolationist.
Cheryl?
Yeah, no, I think what we're seeing is, Biden is able to really demonstrate here that the basis of the party and basically African American voters are really some people who were able to revive his campaign with the endorsement from Jim Clyburn, as well as Southern African American voters, particularly older blacks. He's able to basically be back in the race as a consequence of South Carolina, and people seeing more momentum coming from him, even though in the previous contest prior to South Carolina, he had not performed that well. And I think that says something a lot about where Southern blacks are coming from in their decision to go with Joe Biden. It has a lot to do with their consideration of African American interest, as well as people concerned about how we are going to be able to beat Trump within the contest in the general election, and that although they are strongly Democratic, what the candidates look like in terms of who's going to be able to make that happen for them in November is going to be key.
So Tracy, we know now that Mike Bloomberg has said he's going to be reassessing his campaign tomorrow, even after spending $500 million. What does that tell us about the campaign he ran and his place in American politics?
Well, the whole thing was an experiment for Mike Bloomberg. There's no doubt about it. Nobody's ever gone about it quite the way he did. But he's also made clear that if he himself doesn't have a path forward, his money is still there, and his money would be made available to the nominee. Now, Bernie Sanders has already said no thank you to that money, but I know that the track record Mike Bloomberg has of committing money to key issues is where he'd likely go. Issues like fighting gun violence or combating climate change. This is where you could see Mike Bloomberg's money becoming incredibly useful on the issues that voters care about, if not the nominee, him or herself.
So, Tim, we heard Cheryl talk there about the endorsements. We know in the last 48 hours, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar endorsed Biden, creating this Joe-mentum, they're calling it. Is that just window dressing, or does it actually matter when a failed candidate does that?
Well, the most dramatic evidence that it mattered is the fact that it looks like Vice President Biden will win Klobuchar's state of Minnesota, which would have been inconceivable a few days ago. His ability to compete and maybe win in Texas is a product of his getting the same-day Buttigieg vote and the Klobuchar vote. He is outperforming all of the states where he was before because of these endorsements. What has happened is that a large chunk of the Democratic coalition, David mentioned it, has shifted towards Biden because they think he can beat Trump. That's exactly what's happened. Klobuchar and Buttigieg made a case for Biden being the best opponent to Donald Trump. And that is what's giving Biden the edge in many states today.
David, in terms of a primary season, have you ever really seen a 72 hours like the last 72 hours?
Well, there have been amazing comebacks. Bill Clinton's before, but this may be the steepest. But in a way, we shouldn't be so surprised by it. Bernie Sanders went to Democrats with this proposition. In the face of the best economy since the late 1990s, in a year in which almost 60% of Americans rate their personal finances good or excellent, at a time when more Americans say they're happy with their personal health insurance than at any time since the 1990s, Bernie Sanders said, I want to revolutionize the system. And people said, that sounds risky. He said, well, don't worry, because although I will lose you votes in the suburbs, the people who delivered us the victory of 2018, I'm going to get this giant new turnout of young people and first-time voters. And this primary was a test. Did that work? There was a huge surge of vote, and it was from not first-time voters, not young people, but older people, African Americans, especially in the South, suburban voters, especially women. It was the 2018 coalition that came back, and they said, Bernie Sanders, you're a bad bet, and your message is too radical, and your coalition is not as strong as you promised Democrats it would be.
So of all the people here, Tracy, you are the Democratic strategist, and I know you're working the phones. What are you hearing from the party tonight?
Perhaps the most important statistic comes from an exit poll across the Super Tuesday states. And that is, of the voters polled, 84% of them said they will support the nominee no matter what. And so throughout all of this, and with the 6 contests next week and the 4 contests the week after that, that is a massive amount, a huge majority of voters who said we're there for this nominee. So whatever may happen, that is a figure to keep in mind. It is about defeating Donald Trump. That said, another interesting figure from tonight is that voters continue to say health care is their top concern as it relates to their family and affordability and costs and access. And so that conversation will continue, as David was alluding to. So the consistent, the notion that people will stick with the nominee is hugely important, and that health care matters is also key. At the end of the day, Democrats want Trump out and a much better person in.
Okay, so sticking with the nominee, that sounds very different from 2016. Cheryl, very quickly, I'm curious as to which demographic group, which geographic location you think is about to be pounced upon by these campaigns.
Yeah, I think basically where they're probably going to be aiming some of their attention is going to be to Latino voters and seeing how their support is going to shift, or are they going to say Nevada was a signal that seems to say that Latino voters were very much behind Sanders. We're seeing some of that support showing also in Texas. I think the East Coast will also play a role as well, and also looking at African American voters outside of the southern region, right? So where do we see them being situated, and especially the younger demographic of African American voters being individuals that were with Sanders. If Biden is seen as for the party to be the strongest person, they would need to work on those voters and getting them on board with Biden.
Okay, so Tim, in about 15 seconds, can you give us some perspective? How unusual is this moment for American politics?
This moment is highly unusual. There are always twists and turns in American politics, but if you look at how Biden has gone from single digits or low double digits a week ago to now being in a commanding position in just a day, that's unusual, that's dramatic, and for Bernie Sanders, it's a real problem.
Okay, so I want to ask about a critical choice for Democrats, the running mate, why the choice for VP matters more than ever, even on the Republican side, and why Canadians should be watching this closely. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our Super Tuesday coverage. I'm here with our U.S. political panel. These are our rock stars: David Frum, Tracy Seffel, Tim Naftali, and Cheryl Laird. So, Tim, can we bring this back to Canada? We're not just dispassionately observing what's happening with our neighbors. A lot of what happens in the U.S. flows north. So what do we need to watch for here?
Well, Canada likely doesn't want another hormonal 4 years in the United States. A disruptive presidency is a problem for neighbors. If Joe Biden becomes the nominee and is elected, you can see a restoration of the kind of relationship that Canada enjoyed when President Obama was in power. Joe Biden is committed to NAFTA. You would not see any trouble with the USMCA. I think Canada could anticipate a very good relationship with Joe Biden. With Bernie Sanders, you will be encountering, well, somebody who enjoys maple syrup, but somebody who is a protectionist. So you'd be seeing some of the disruptive qualities of Donald Trump in a Bernie Sanders presidency. So Canada has real stakes in this election, and tonight is a good day for U.S.-Canada relations if you're a Biden supporter, because he looks much stronger tonight.
David, I can see you concentrating. What do you make of that?
No, I think Tim's exactly right. I think between the coronavirus and the softening of the world economy that has struck in the wake of that terrible disease, that emerging disease, we're reminded their walls don't work. This is an integrated world, and Canada and the United States share an especially close relationship that can't be bordered off. And so to move away from Donald Trump's false attempt at isolationism toward more normal trade, more normal security relationships, more normal public health relationships in a 2020s that may be a less easy time than the late 2010s were with the long expansion from 2010 to 2020. Canada may be about to have a better partner.
So, Tracy, I have rarely heard so much talk about why a VP matters. I grew up going to school thinking nobody cares about the vice president. Why is the running mate so key this time?
Well, some of it might be due to HBO's wonderful show Veep, but nonetheless, I think that in a large part, there is a sector of this electorate that is saying, what about women? And I know that this is an issue that's come up in other ways, but it may be manifesting itself most directly as it relates to a VP picked. I don't see any scenario where a nominee, be it Bernie Sanders or be it Joe Biden, does not pick a woman. And I know that there are Democrats who believe it is well past time for that to happen.
Can I interrupt here for a second?
Absolutely.
I just wanted time to get Cheryl in here. What are your thoughts on the VP? I know you have some.
Yeah, no, I think Tracy's right on point with that. And in thinking about also major people who are players within the party and serve as the base of the party, African-American voters in this case are people who would potentially want to see something reflected in that as well, especially coming off of Barack Obama. So anything like Stacey Abrams or Kamala Harris would be signaling to those individuals and be possibly mobilizing for them and going out to vote for Joe Biden or for Bernie Sanders as the nominee.
And do you think we'll be hearing from them soon in terms of you know, people I know looking at the body language, Stacey Abrams sitting next to Joe Biden, you know, where is Kamala Harris tonight? When do you expect we'll hear something?
I mean, typically it's something that is announced at the nomination convention, right? So if it came out earlier, I think there are ways in which that would have to be done very carefully, because some would say that it's being too soon, right? That decision of putting Stacey Abrams, for instance, in that position, or Kamala Harris would be done kind of too quickly. So I think it has to be thoughtful in how it's done, but it could happen sooner than the convention than we expect.
Okay. All right,
Adrian,
everyone,
let me make a final point on that.
You know what? I'm so sorry. We've got to go. I could talk all night about this, but we do have to go.
Endorsements are going to matter, and surrogates too. So we'll see women out there for Biden.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Well, coming up next, rethinking travel plans over the coronavirus.
To send children to Europe at this stage just does not make any sense to me whatsoever.
Is it time to put that dream vacation on hold? We'll look at the dilemma some Canadians are facing right after the break. Welcome back. As the spread of the coronavirus prompts new travel warnings, people's plans to see the world are suddenly in question. Kayla Hounsell spoke to some Canadians worried about whether a trip abroad is worth the risk.
So was there anything new posted at any time this morning here, Siobhan?
No, more and more parents want to pull out.
Breakfast at the O'Toole House these days is combined with keeping a close eye on a planned school trip to Europe. 16-year-old Ryan is supposed to go next week.
I could possibly be put into quarantine or even get the virus myself. I would hate to do that. And if I didn't notice, I could spread it here and harm people.
Students will travel to Madrid, Paris, and Rome. The Canadian government is advising against all non-essential travel to northern Italy.
I'm going to forfeit the monies that we paid and keep my son safe.
Which is how much?
$4,600.
Canada is also advising against non-essential travel to China and Iran. Other countries have lower-level advisories. The government isn't saying don't go, but is recommending Canadians practice special precautions.
The one that I'm more concerned about is Tokyo, because
Matt Whalen is planning a trip to Japan with his sister. He used to live there while teaching English and promised to bring her back. As type 1 diabetics, they both have compromised immune systems.
We are at slightly higher risk for either contracting a virus like COVID-19 or being more seriously affected. So, we might require hospitalization where somebody else might not.
So anybody who has diabetes, who has heart disease or hypertension or respiratory illnesses, they should be thinking about not traveling at this point in time.
For the O'Tooles, there's no question.
People are dying, and to send children to Europe at this stage just does not make any sense to me whatsoever.
Today, Nova Scotia's education minister says the provincial government is considering cancelling all school trips. That would allow the O'Tooles to make an insurance claim. They're still hoping their son can go to Europe another time when coronavirus is no longer a concern. Kayla Hounsell, CBC News, Westfall, Nova Scotia.
Well, when it comes to fighting the coronavirus, there is a simple message echoed around the world tonight. And it seems everyone has a different way to say, wash your hands. It's tonight's moment. Next.
Wash your hands like you've been chopping jalapenos and you need to change your contacts.
Ouch. Okay, that is a perfect analogy from BC's health officer to drive home a serious message about protecting yourself from COVID-19. So we found videos from around the world with that same bottom line, that unified international plea to lather up. That's tonight's moment.
wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. Count to 20. Sing happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday.
Tops and bottoms in between.
Jeff Turkey is spreading my lies. Jeff Turkey.
Hit me up with a little sexual healing, please.
So
What was the one guy singing? The guy in the
or something?
Is that what it was?
I think so.
I couldn't make out what he was saying.
Yes, let's wash our hands. And we're all learning some stuff here, but when we were in Liberia covering Ebola, one of the things people talked about is not shaking hands, which is a discussion we may have to have at this country. So we didn't shake hands, we didn't do the fist bump.
Oh, you do?
did the
You
elbow
do like
tap.
the elbow bump? Right. Well, and let's not forget, I mean, good sort of hand washing hygiene, this is something that maybe folks should be doing all the time. Not just today. That's the National for this March 3rd. Have a good night.
Good night.